All right, everyone. This last lecture is on the race relationships on the web. And I want to begin by outlining three possible ways of approaching the relationship between race and the internet. The first perspective is materialist, that is, it's mostly concerned with the way the internet remediates and extends existing socioeconomic divisions. The second approach is more social-cultural. It considers, for example, as we have seen in the article by Sarah Florini, how social network sites such as Twitter amplify, reproduce, and perhaps also remediate existing identity politics. And the third approach is more techno-cultural and is most evident in the article by Dana Boyd, White Flight from Network Publics, and is about how different platforms call into being different forms of subjectivity as different platforms have embed different technical affordances which reflect in a certain sense and perhaps even incorporate different ways of thinking and performing race. So the first approach, this is mostly derived from an article by Wilson and Costanza Schock from 2011 called The Costs of Network Exclusion. And in this article, these two authors claim that online culture has not significantly decreased racial inequality on three levels in terms of access. These are data more from 2008, 2009, but at the time, only 29% of poor working households, which include not only, of course, minorities, but also white poor households, had broadband access to the internet. Second, and this is a very significant data, the ownership of internet publishing companies such as the Huffington Post, for example, are only 10% of these companies are owned by minorities, which means that 90% are owned by whites, which is a ratio that is not that different from the one that you would have with traditional media. And therefore, it also in terms of voice, yes, the internet might be diverse, but the voices of white are on more popular sites and therefore are disproportionately heard as opposed to the voices of other of minorities such as blacks and Latinos. However, there are also other data, and these are more recent data, that show, for example, how African Americans and Latinos rely more heavily than whites on mobile for internet access. On average, they own, especially the youth, more smartphones than their white counterparts. And Twitter penetration, for example, is much higher among African Americans than whites, especially in the 18-29 bracket. As you can see, 40% of African Americans have a Twitter account, whereas only 28% of whites own one. So the second approach is the social cultural approach in this article on signifying as a cultural practice on Twitter. Sarah Florini claims that signifying is a cultural practice through which racial identity has been performed for a long time, of course, well before the internet and even modern media such as television. But because in the online world, the bodily signifiers of race can be easily clouded and obscured, the social and cultural markers, if you want, linguistic markers of race take on greater importance as only those who know how to signify online, I'm sorry about that, can really participate in the signifying games that occur through various hashtags on Twitter. So signifying generates a sense of belonging, a clear-cut distinction between an in-group and an out-group. However, it is performed in public and therefore is highly visible and unfiltered. The only limitations, if you want, are the limitations of the technical affordances of the platform, such as the 140 characters limit of Twitter. So it is through this approach that we can look at the third, through this consideration that we can look at the third approach on the techno-cultural mediation of race. And this article by Dana Boyd looks in particular at the period around 2006-2007, when a big migration of users began from Facebook to MySpace. And she uses the metaphor of the white flight from the suburbs of the 1950s, right? When the 1950s left the inner city neighborhoods to suburbanize America. The suburbs, of course, were associated with upward mobility, with adding to college, whereas the inner city neighborhoods in the 1950s were associated with the working class, with poverty, with dysfunctional families, perverts and deviants, freaks and outcasts, thieves, and in a certain sense, a general sense of danger. So how does she apply this metaphor to the relationship between Facebook and MySpace? Well, obviously Facebook is the suburbs of the internet. It has Ivy League roots. It is created as an elite social network site, as we know, by Mark Zuckerberg at Harvard, and therefore it has this highbrow aura that MySpace didn't have, and it is associated with college as a rite of passage. MySpace, by contrast, is associated with musicians. Since the very beginning, a lot of bands opened their accounts on MySpace to create a closer relationship with their fan base. So it is associated with late night socialites, with the urban party crowd, with therefore also with adulthood, status, and freedom, for example, to go out by yourself to music parties. So it is around September 2006, Boyd notes that this self-sorting of users who were more attracted to Facebook and users who were more attracted to MySpace began. And she collects a lot of interviews with teenagers, late the age group that she interviews, it's mostly between 15 and 18, 19. And for example, one of these users says, my impression is that MySpace is for the riffraff and Facebook is for the landed gentry. It's an interesting metaphor. So from a Facebook perspective, Facebook is exclusive. It is kind of this designer class of people. These are all quotes from the interviews she collected with users of both sides. It's the latest thing, whereas MySpace is gaudy, is tacky, and cluttered. From a MySpace perspective, Facebook is boring, is lame and elitist. It limits individuality because MySpace had a functionality in the interface that allow you to redesign, for example, your background. Therefore, it allowed for higher customization. So MySpace is glitter, it's produced by those who pimp out, it's cool, it allows for self-expression, etc. So there are obviously here different values, right, which we can understand them as different cultural values that are associated also with different racial groups, as Latinos and African Americans tended to stick around that time to MySpace, whereas whites tended to migrate en masse to Facebook. So for some, some prefer, to have the ability to radically shape their profiles to their liking, to customize their pages, as I said in the case of MySpace, and others prefer instead an enforced cleanliness. So there is this sociological term, homophily, which means love of the same, that helps us explain a lot of different social phenomena. If you want, you can also call it as the law of imitation. If you're white and all your friends are on Facebook, if you want to hang out with them, you have to open a Facebook account, and vice versa. If you're black or Latino and all your friends are sticking to MySpace, then you will keep running your MySpace account. On top of that, what favored Facebook around that time is that due to privacy modifications, parents saw Facebook as a safer alternative to MySpace, especially in relation to anxieties of sexual predators. So my questions for you are two questions. Do you think, first, that the web allows for a shift in the perception representation of race, Or does the web simply reproduces existing racial inequalities, existing racial relationships? So to what extent is the web a mirror of reality, and to what extent does it actually change the relationships of race, as for example you can pretend to be somebody else online? And second, related question, but also a different question. Do you notice significant differences between the way racial identity is mediated by traditional media such as television, radio, and the press, and the way it is mediated, or more accurately we should say remediated on the web? Thank you for watching and listening. It was a pleasure to give these lectures, and especially to read your feedback, which I'm looking forward to read also this time. Bye.